to this next panel. We've got a great set of guests for you. We're talking about open banking in Europe. Where do we stand? I mean, open banking has been around for a fair few years now, and we've been through that Gartner hype cycle. We had that big set of excitement where everyone was like, wow, hold on a minute. We can let fintechs connect to banking data. We can let them make transactions, can get transactional data, can do clever things and actually create and spawn this whole new industry of service providers. Let's get going, let's get going. And so regulation was passed, and that took a while. Then that regulation turned into a series of plans across the UK, across Europe. And then we saw some delays and some more delays, and then a few more delays. Like, where are we? Where are we now? And luckily, we've got a great panel here to help us think about open banking. What's it really about? Where the success is going to come, if there are going to be any. What's happened with the delays and what's been happening behind the scenes. And really, where are we at? So let's have a minute intro of who you are and what organization you come from.
Okay. Liliana Fratini Passi, I'm the CEO of CBI. Over the last 20 years, CBI serves the financial communities in the definition of standards for the customer-to-bank payment initiation activities. CBI used by more than 3 million of corporates in cash management in Italy, and so we manage the infrastructure of this payment initiation and definition of standards, as well as the definition of common services in the area of electronic bill presentment and payment, and recently the launch of CBI Globe in the open banking ecosystem, being an industry utility for the financial community.
Thank you.
Hello, I am Burkovic, CEO and co-founder at Bridge. So Bridge is a leader of open banking solution provider. We enable insurers, bank, credit provider, accounting software, retailers to capture the benefit of open banking. We connect more than 8 million bank accounts every day for account aggregation. And we are very proud to announce that with Bridge Pay, our PIS services, we have initiated already more than 1 billion euro. So we are at the heart of open banking since 10 years now. So I know quite everything about open banking, so very happy to be on stage with you.
Thank you. Christopher Andvig, I'm the founder and CEO of Neonomics, formerly known as Bankbridge. Not the same. We work on aggregation, but also providing open banking services. So we hold a PI license, a PISP license, and an AISP license. We are currently live in the Nordics, have more than 1,650 banks, both in the Nordics and outside the Nordics connected. Main office in Oslo, 40 people working on open banking. Thank you.
Brilliant. Hello, everyone. My name's Imran. I'm the trustee of the open banking implementation entity. The entity that I run is a bit different from all these others in the sense that it is actually a not-for-profit organization. It's been mandated on the largest banks in the UK by our Competition Markets Authority, and I've been appointed by the Competition Markets Authority to run that entity. What we've done is we've used PSD2 to design a single API standard that we have the power to mandate that the 9 largest banks in the UK use. That's for AIS and PIS. We're at a stage now where we are just about through with the implementation. We've got over 75 non-mandated banks also using the UK API standards, which means that you've got market coverage of around about 99% and we've got over 300 TPPs, third parties, fintechs in our ecosystem, all making connections. And yeah, we're very pleased to say that we've got live flow going through at the moment, and just last week we announced that we hit more than 1 million users of open banking APIs.
So I guess that's a good place to start. I mean, we've got Norway, France, Italy, the UK. What is the state? Are we saying that open banking, is open for business, that actually consumers should be jumping on all kinds of services that are out there now? Is that it?
I can go first. We're not quite there yet. The way that I would describe it is the APIs are in market, but there's a lot of work to do to get the performance of those APIs in a position where business-critical services can be built off them. There's a lot of work to do to ensure that payments functionality is built out. We've got almost no payments API volume going through in the UK at all. So that's where I'm focusing a lot of my efforts. But some of the TPPs that enrolled in open banking 2-3 years ago have now got mature-ish products out in the market. And even though we've got 300, I'd say that there's about 20 with some decent products. And I think what we're going to see in 2020 is that growth. So the 1 million that we got at the moment, that doubled in under 6 months, and I expect it to double again in a shorter period.
So, Johan, I mean, account information service stuff, that's been around for a long time. People have been scraping and using APIs, and is anything really changed just apart from the technology that people do that with?
That's true that open banking exists for more than 10 years across Europe, so it's not, open banking is not coming today. The complexity is a transition period between an old technology, calling screen scraping or direct access, to APIs. And the transition in parallel of strong customer authentication implementation. And it's especially difficult when you have a massive user base, millions of users to migrate, with the pressure from the regulator, but also from the bank to use the APIs, while the APIs are not ready yet. And they are not ready yet because it's so complex to build a great APIs to absorb this massive user base. So it's not easy. And I think PSD2 is only one very small part of open banking. It's only payment in account. It's about 20% of the accounts connected today. So the other 80% is credit, savings, and all the financial products. So the complexity today is to handle APIs, PIDs do not ready, to help the banks to do it, to discuss with the regulator. Some banks are willing to do the job well, some others are maybe not as willing to do so good. So, and in parallel, we have to maintain the service with the consumers. So we cannot stop and say, sorry, it's not ready, we have to stop the service. That's complex.
And so how is it in France as compared to the rest of Europe?
I think in France we have something very, very good, is the national regulators that understood quite deeply and quite early the problems, and force all the stakeholders to come around the table and to discuss and to solve the problem, and not to implement SCA, strong customer authentication, like too fast, or to exempt API too fast, and to understand if it's working or not, and to say if it's not working, you have to solve the problem. Because I think one of the mistakes we've done is to say that PSD2 and open banking is a compliance transformation. It's a use case, it's businesses, it's technology, but it's not compliance. And the thing is, we put PSD2 and open banking in the end of the regulator, and now I don't know how to handle it. And I think one very positive thing in France is that the national regulators is doing the job, even it's very difficult for him.
They're doing the job, but still the SCA deadline has been, put back another 18 months, and we're still no closer to seeing that functionality in market. Yes?
Can you rephrase the question, sorry?
We're moving along, but we're still a long way from seeing strong customer authentication in market.
Yeah, the thing is, we are saying that we need this kind of data or these kind of features. And some of other stakeholders are saying, no, we are compliant. And when we try the API, we say, yeah, but without these functionalities, we cannot migrate. So now we ask the regulator, do we need these features or not? And it's very difficult for the regulators to say yes or no. And then they say, okay, we should ask EBA. And so we are waiting for 6 months or 10 months to have an answer. And even when we get an answer, maybe there is 10 more questions after this. So we are just losing time.
So, Christophe, have we just gone about this the wrong way round? Like building infrastructure for use cases that haven't really been defined?
Good question. I think that the use cases haven't been defined, but I think the users and the banks need to define them. It's about innovating on the user flow We launched an open banking service which wasn't a PSD2 service in April, which had to do with the deposit accounts. And that had to do with improving the user flow. It came from a third-party provider that wanted to provide a better flow, and we were able to enable it through open banking. Are we live in the Nordics? Yes and no. Some banks are, some are not. And I think we need to see the good use cases. But will you see them? Well, I think you will experience them, but maybe not think of them as open banking.
But I guess, Liliana, my skepticism is that we're asking big banks that are traditionally focused on product creation and distribution to then come up with these new amazing services that will then be the requirements for API creation. And generally, the answer tends to be aggregation. Surely that's the killer use case, isn't it?
Yes, of course. CBA Globe is one of the leading platforms in Italy, one of the fourth, aggregating the 80% of the Italian market, more than 300 of financial institutions in the role of ASPSP chosen CBI. And in this of course, job, we try to cooperate, having a collaborative approach, helping the financial industry in the identification of the API implementation guidelines from one hand, independently on the platform on which this API should be applied, and on the other, trying to help in those banks have chosen CBI to share some common services in terms of fraud detection and to better comply to all the PSD2 requirements. Of course, cutting the cost dramatically, sure, because this was the reasons why everything has been started from a strategic industrial plan. What we have learned now, we of course are following three main approach in helping our customers, our banks from one hand, and on the other the TPPs that which are of course willing to talk and having a hub and spoke way of approaching these banks. We are continuous to maintaining this API mandatory API, and on the other hand, we are following some useful use case in helping medium, small, and big banks in doing better their open banking business. But
let's stop there and say, well, yeah, what are the killer use cases? What are the use cases that you're driving? What are the use cases that you're driving?
First of all, we are working with a market committee in which we engage not only banks, not only TPPs, but also some public administrations. And from this market committee, we are now understanding that there is an interesting demand from corporates in using some very useful services typical of a banks. I'm referring, for instance, the Know Your Customers process, very interesting from some utilities in identifying if the customers is a good or not good. So maybe
can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Can I say
we are working on it, or for instance, some use case.
I'm going to jump in and get other people to jump in. So what do you think on for you? What are going to be these big use cases? Because look, who cares about HTTP and HTML, but it powers the internet, and everyone cares about Facebook. No one cares about the infrastructure. So, like, you guys work in the industry. What do you think? What would you put your money on in terms of things coming along?
I think it's already massive, but it's unknown. For example,
is that a cop-out? Come on. Is that a bit of a cop-out? Come on.
Yeah. For example, you have accounting software. They need to connect bank account to do the accounting.
Okay.
So today they are massively connecting the bank account of their customers thanks to open banking.
Great.
So we now innovate for companies. They are better in managing their money. When you had AIS and PIS, you can enter into cash management innovation for all the companies across Europe and across the world. If you think about credit scoring, you need to understand the financial situation of somebody. Today it's done manually. We are in 2020. We are not in the 90s. That's already changing the industry. For example, we partner with Experience. We just make credit score seamless, just more free, and much more relevant. We increase the profitability of credit. When you think about retailers, what about PIS and retailers? When you heard the European Commission saying we need European payment system. We don't want Visa, MasterCard just to get a monopoly of it. That's why PSD2 instant payment was invented. Now it's becoming real. But that's also difficult because today the way it's implemented, the user experience is not good enough, so you cannot compete. When you think about KYC, maybe we can check some information directly to the bank to see if the name is the same that the customer is declaring. So there is a lot of use cases. It's massive, but it's unknown, and it's already using.
Christophe?
I agree with many of the use cases you mentioned, especially on the corporate side, where we have yet to see full traction on the corporate side, both for AIS and PIS. When it comes to the other use cases, I think that it's important to realize the difference between PSD2 and open banking. Yes, we will see some good use cases just on PSD2, but this is also where I would challenge the banks actually to go beyond PSD2, because if you're going to see the real good use cases, you need to go beyond PSD2. You need to open up different accounts. You need to think of how can these products actually be distributed through third parties. Because the whole idea behind PSD2 was to get better competition. But the banks themselves, instead of thinking these as threats, they can actually think of these as opportunities, distribution networks of their own products.
I guess one of the problems is that this sort of pulls back the curtain of aging banking infrastructure. If we've got batch-based overnight work and batch-based overnight systems that will not deal with 1 million people hitting them with API calls for real-time transactions, or send push notifications to people when they make, their purchase, does that severely hinder the opportunities for doing more interesting use cases that we're talking about, or will those things come along in time?
I think it's a question of time. You're absolutely right. The old legacy system is definitely holding things back. We see a huge difference between the banks that have more modern systems compared to the older banks with the old systems. The newer banks are able to innovate quicker. They've been the first ones to be compliant. They are the first ones to launch second-generation PSD2 products. So we do see a huge difference. The old legacy banks tend to build a middle layer just to jump fence beyond the core systems.
Sure. So Imran, what do you see as the key use cases that are going to drive the industry?
Well, I'd actually agree with the very nice list that Joan put together just then. I think we've got quite a good bit of MI as to what's going on in the UK. The things that got the ball rolling were actually overdraft unbundling. So that's a very specific use case where those people who pay too much for their overdrafts shared their account information with a third party, and then when they were about to go overdrawn, the third party would put the money into the account, and they would get they'd be able to borrow 50 to 90% cheaper. It's a really valuable thing that kind of gets competition going and puts the banks on the back foot. But then all the other use cases I absolutely agree with. Accounting software is a very big one for small businesses. I think when the PIS stuff comes, ID&V, we'd perhaps not talked about so much. That's even in other sectors. Everyone wanting to know, prove who your Uber drivers are, to prove, that your eBay merchants are for real. You can actually use open banking data to help with part of that.
But that's a really interesting one, because please correct me, but there doesn't seem to be like a great set of identity-based APIs around banking, just to say, yes, that is who you say you are.
Well, I think that's the link to the point that Christopher was just touching on, which is that the regulatory APIs allow for a base set of functionality, and in some regard they are a miss because they just don't cover a whole bunch of products that you would otherwise get through screen scraping. But in other regards, that represents an opportunity for the bank. So what we're trying to encourage in the UK, and we're just at the very early stages of this, is premium APIs. So given that the banks have spent all of that money building the security framework, the trust framework, they've got the API gateways up and running, there is other information they can put down exactly the same pipes. And really, I think a lot of that comes down to identity. And not necessarily the full-fat identity that we kind of have been trying to push for in the UK, but almost attributes associated with identity. So if you want to prove your age in order to buy some alcohol or get something off the internet, then you can actually do that using premium APIs. The banks need to stop thinking about this in terms of compliance and start thinking about compete and innovate. I think it's a matter of time, but I might be proven wrong.
I would like to add that the first industry using open banking is the bank industry today already.
Yes.
To provide better services to their own clients. The better advice.
Yes.
And the thing is, you're absolutely right. I think the mistake is to take into compliance side of the mindset. And now I think time is coming to talk about business and business with banks, because the banks are saying it's a compliance and it's cost.
Yes.
But they are using it massively to improve their services already. And we need to find business model that is good for the bank, for the TPPs, and for the consumers. And this discussion was not happened so far, and I think it's this year that it will come.
I do think that's super interesting. I talk to banking clients about APIs, and they approach it from a banking product perspective. Therefore, aggregation is an obvious example. But when you bring up the example of a great API business, Uber, ultimately no one classifies that as an API business, but it uses APIs that connect to the phone, geolocation, Google Maps and TomTom directions, and Braintree for payments and internal API. It makes that end-to-end journey, of which payments is just one part of it, and makes that seamless. And that's what I'm hearing from you in terms of accounting. Whenever there's a situation where I have to check a bank, I then go over here, then I have to go and back. Whether it's home buying or accounting or loyalty or identity or a variety of things. But that's not the way banks think. They're banks. Liliana?
Yes, I would also underline that through centralized platform is also able to enforce some distributions in a new way of APIs. Now we are focusing how to scale up the business of the banks, enforcing this distribution role of the banks. Thanks to a centralized showcase where you can host a lot of use cases, independently of a single company developing a use case or another. We are totally free, independent of a repeat of a company to another, but we are now focusing which is the best partnership or players which can help the financial institutions in foster the business to their customers. If we consider through ATM, mobile banking, and physical branches, banks is an intermediary. So we have to underline and to enforce this role, also thanks to API, and maybe thanks to the open data economy, maybe helping and working with the public administration. We could help banks offering, for instance, the request of a passport or a citizen through the mobile app of a bank. So to create a new way of distribution of services thanks to
But I guess that causes a big problem, and I've heard it said that only 10% of the open banking question is really a technical solution. It's all about the fact that if we're connecting a variety of these providers at different layers together, then suddenly whose fault is it when something goes wrong? How do we protect this thing? How do we extend the financial system into other business areas? Seems like a minefield. I mean, that must be your day-to-day job.
Yeah, so because we started with open banking as a remedy for improving competition in the markets, and then we were asked to align it to PSD2. PSD2 actually came after. We kind of started with a bit more of a blank piece of paper and absolutely spent a ton of time thinking about what's the trust framework that underpins open banking so that bad actors can't get into the system. Not something that really comes through PSD2. And also, we were required by the UK government to build a customer redress mechanism. And what that is for the first time, a kind of an automated workflow that ensures that a customer doesn't get lost. Because the risk is that, historically, financial services works on a vertically integrated basis. So if something goes wrong, you know who to call. It's kind of your bank or your financial advisor or your insurance company. In open banking, the ecosystem is very complicated. So what we've done is ensure that if the customer goes to one participant in the ecosystem, that complaint will get dealt with and they won't get pushed around from one party to the other. That was the big concern that we've got. So all of the UK banks effectively sign up to a customer redress mechanism, which is yet another technology solution that means that all that information is shared.
We were talking before about what is, when it's a financial product and I have a monetary loss, then we know what customer redress is. I lost money, you give me the money back. But when something happens that affects my data or my reputation or wasn't me or is terrorist funding or something strange, like how does redress work?
Well, to be honest, I think that's something we're going to have to sort out across all sectors. That's not specific to financial services. What happens if an airline company loses my flight details or the post office loses my address? And what if it's out there already anyway? So all of this really complicated stuff is being worked through by the Information and Commissioner's Office. They've got the benefit of working with GDPR. I think we're kind of waiting for that to come to us.
Christopher, how much of your business is really technology and how much of it is all the rest of this?
Well, I would say a 50-50 part. So I would say probably the last year, 70% of the business has been around organizing the compliance side, organizing the infrastructure around actually providing the tech products. So everything from eIDAS certificates to actually activating them within the banks, which has been, I think, many of the banks they hadn't done it before, so they needed to learn as well. How do we do this? So a lot has been about education, FSA education, bank education, TPP education, a lot of that. So yes, and insurance, you mentioned that, also an important factor. So the insurance companies, they didn't know how to approach this. So come June last year, and the insurance companies, they were kind of lost as to how to approach this. Even the largest players in Europe, they didn't know how to do it. So yes, it's been a lot of, 50% of the business has been about understanding and dealing with that. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Johan, does this prevent sort of small startups from entering the market with truly innovative players, given that we've had to layer on all of this regulation and insurance and requirements and security and audit and whatever else in order to make things work?
If you are talking about business, 80% of the discussion is business, maybe the technology, the business model, the use cases, etc. The contract part is also, but it's a small part, and that's where you negotiate the responsibilities, etc. The thing with PSD2 is because it's EU directive compliance, and the lawmakers, when they were writing the text, they were so intense, different interests. It was difficult for them to have a consensus. So the law is vague. So now there is every compliance officer reading the law and interpret it in a way. you have 1,000 different interpretations.
Yeah.
And so now we are discussing all the interpretation. So we are losing 90% of our discussion it's about how should we interpret the text. And we have all different interpretation of the market. And also, I think what...
But I guess that's why some of you are on stage.
Yeah.
Because there's this, actually you might say the biggest winner or winners in PSD2 and open banking are intermediaries that can start bringing all of this together and providing that one-stop shop, no?
Yeah. So yeah, our business is to manage this complexity, regulatory complexity, technology complexity. But the thing is, there is one other thing, is the bank, naturally, they think about trust, security. So it's like we are doing it by ourselves. It's not in their ADN to open their system and to collaborate about this. So there is a lack of trust. So this is why on every single point, how can I trust you? Even if we are regulated, it's not in their ADN. That's, and especially if you talk with compliance officer, we have in front of us. So I think it's a mistake, and we are losing time every time about this.
So Liliana, how is it in Italy?
Yes, well, in Italy, but in Europe in general, we should take into account well, an aspect which is a level playing field. From one hand, we have ASPSP, financial institutions, which are even more regulated, so under a specific financial regulations, national and cross borders. We have organizations which oversight the activities of financial institutions. Then we have a legislation which forces a financial institution to open their information, considering that the customer is the owner, and he is the duty and the power to authorize. But if we remember the genesis of the first PSD and then the PSD2. At that time, the idea was to regulate some practices which were not so transparent to the market. But in the end, we faced to some negative, in my idea, externality. I'm referring to the fact that now we have financial institutions which for the legislations, the PSD2 are obliged to give their data to the third parties providers. On the other side, no legislation obliged Google, Amazon, Apple, and other players to give their information. So you see a different level of regulations. And so in the end, we had a very strange situation where banks has been forced by law to open their forces. So I need, in my opinion, there is a very important need to manage this and consider the phenomena a very global phenomenon, as well from a regulation and as well as from a governance side, because we are, as financial side, we have a very clear and area of bodies with a specific duties. But on the other side, we don't have a clear structure.
Well, I guess we only have to look at the. We'd have to look at the big players of the world, or what's happening with open data in Australia, and the complexities of even just addressing a subset of that with the financial services thing. I guess what I'm taking from this is it's complicated, it's difficult. We're driving forward and addressing the problems bit by bit, and understanding that there will be and are some interesting cases where finance suddenly joins that end-to-end journey of other things, of commerce that happens in our life, but that actually this is still a way off. Is that accurate?
I think that you're touching upon a very, very good point, which most of the regulators haven't thought of, because you say that we as intermediaries, we are the ones who we get out as winners, which is true, but it's actually not good to see how the ambition of PSD2, which was actually to give these smaller third parties access, is actually being complicated when you look at the regulators. The regulators have the requirements of insurance, but the AIGs and the Lloyds they do not want to provide insurance for the small companies because they do not have the history that the large companies have. So the ASPSPs, they are allowed to do the PSD2 services, but the smaller companies are not able to. Not necessarily because they're not able to technically, but again, back to the compliance side. They're not necessarily able to fulfill the requirements from the regulator.
I think we could probably make some introductions in the UK. Well, one of the things we're very lucky to do, I remember 3 years ago when we realised this, no insurers were willing to cover, we took a walk down to Lloyd's of London and sat with a guy with a pen and kind of like wearing a wig from 400 years ago. And he said, we could do this. And they started writing contracts. So, I mean, this stuff is hard and it's all very new. I do believe that we're on the first step of a very long road. And it's not a road that has been predetermined for us. I sometimes very jealously look at the Australians and see how they have ambitiously set sector after sector after sector. They're stuck on the first one, but at least they have a vision. We don't have a vision in Europe or in the UK. But I'm hoping that we're going to get one soon because there is a very live discussion going on in the UK at the moment around what we call open finance. And open finance will absolutely meet the requirements of those screen scrapers because it is talking about mortgages, pensions, insurance and savings all having their open banking moment and that data being made available via APIs. Now, the secret to getting it to work is all in the regulators learning from what's happened in the past, the incumbents learning how to implement better, and then also actually the TPPs being able to knit this stuff together quickly. But at least we're having the conversation.
Well, that's great. So we've got 5 minutes left. What are your burning questions? We've got a knowledgeable group here. What would you like to know? Hands up if you've got a question. The lady here. I think your mic's coming.
Thank you, Jason. My name is Liesel Jurjens from EY Amsterdam. And we do help our clients also with helping them to making propositions for open banking, PSD2. And we do struggle with the integrations of accounting software and so on. So I was wondering, which parties in the market do you see as leading in having it all integrated other than parties in Australia?
There you go. Who's doing it well? Who's doing it best?
I would say it differs. For AIS, I would say France and the UK. And for PIS, it's more...
Sorry, who in the UK?
Sorry?
Who in the UK, sorry?
You mean the global
Sorry.
Global APIs, I mean.
Well.
Yeah,
right.
France and the UK is good for AIS. Okay. PIS is more the German market and the Nordics. It's also linked to the massive use cases, daily use by consumers. In France and the UK, AIS is massively used. It's not the case for the Nordics. It's much more PIS, so that's logic.
Did I answer your question?
Well, I was actually looking for parties.
Parties, like companies?
Yeah, companies that are really examples in the market.
In terms of providing open banking solution?
Really, we talked about killer use cases. So what are the killer use cases and the parties that really made it happen already? Other than yourself, potentially?
Well, I can only vouch for the clients that I know of. We work with Kivra, who's doing invoicing. So digital invoicing, where the payment is initiated through PIS. So that's a PIS use case. We have a couple of PFM solutions, although I would argue that the value of those are not really there yet, even though lots of money are thrown at the PFM solutions.
Sure.
But on the AIS side, I would also say that credit scoring is where we do see some good cases.
to Imran, I guess. So what would you say for a regulator, let's say in Brazil or Mexico, a place where they're starting this journey right now, something you learned throughout these years that you think can save material time and, you know, go live in half the time it took like other countries to go?
Well, I actually think it is absolutely possible to go live quicker, and sometimes in the emerging markets it's easier than in some of the more developed markets. The things that I tell them are, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. There are some perfectly good standards to use. The open banking ones are open license, but Berlin Group, STET all have standards which they can use as well. I think the other thing is make sure you have a very clear legal framework that the banks have to adhere to, because when push comes to shove, the banks will make this work if it's a compliance exercise. That's the irony or the paradox in what was said earlier. The compliance unit is the best funded unit in the entire bank. And actually, if you want this stuff to happen, I think that's where you need to go. So you need to make it a regulatory requirement. But that, if you can get it right, that will just kickstart the market and move things on. I think the final thing as well is be very, very clear what your vision is. Because, you know, we've had some interesting discussions here around use cases, and you can see there's almost too many and there's also too few, and we're kind of bouncing around between them. A little bit is because there are so many reasons why you might want to do open banking. You know, are you trying to bring more competition to the incumbents? That's a very UK proposition. Are you trying to stimulate the fintech sector? That's a very Mexican proposition. Are you trying to bring competition to MasterCard and Visa? That's a very European proposition. You know, are you trying to improve financial inclusion? Very Brazilian proposition. So figure out kind of what it is you want to do, and then that hopefully will make sure that the regulators, when they write stuff, don't leave it open to man years or woman years of interpretation.
I would think also the problem we have today is linked to strong customer authentication and the way we need to use now APIs. Because open banking were working well before. And today you have two possibilities, the APIs or the direct access. The thing is, with the direct access, it's like screen scraping, but with authentication. That's for the bank to identify that it's a regulated entity that connects. The problem is, as soon as the bank implements strong customer authentication, it's difficult to use direct access. So we need to migrate to APIs. So that's all the complexity is now to how we can use an API very fast while it's not working well. So I think if I would do the law another time, I would say you can build an API if you want. If you don't want, it's direct access. If you want to use API and it's good enough, I think naturally people will use it because it's more stable. It's just more easy to use. But the TPP should be able to handle the ACA. Because if the TPP do not handle the ACA, that the bank handles the ACA, and that block our connection. That's all the problem is the ACA handled by the bank, and the obligation to move through the API to manage this ACA. So that's a problem.
There you go, we got into some detail there. Well, unfortunately, our time's up. I'm sure these guys will be hanging around outside if you want to grab them. I'd like you to join me in thanking our great panel.